Hey everybody, it's Luke with Bring Home Denver, your local real estate experts. Here with us today is our good friend and founder and GC of Sustainabuilt, Mr. James Anders. James, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. James is kind enough to take some time to talk about starting a construction project and all of the things that come with that. So without further ado, James, when starting a project, what are the kind of first things that tend to be on people's minds when they get going?
I think that by the time I get to talk to somebody about doing the construction project, they've been thinking about it for a while, right? I mean, it's been probably months, years of going back and forth, how are we going to do this and so forth. So on their mind is they're ready to go, right? They've pulled the trigger, let's get this done now. But there's so much that actually needs to be done, and I think this is what surprises a lot of people, what needs to be done before we actually can get even going, right? One of those things might be permitting, which can take, even for a residential project, especially in Denver, it can be somewhere between 6 to 18 months. I also, Denver or whatever permitting agency is not necessarily our enemy on things. They're trying to make sure it's done correctly, but it's a long process. The other thing when we're talking about these new projects coming up is people might have thought about the general concept of wanting to have a bigger home. They might have thought about wanting to be in a place to where they have more light in their home. But they haven't thought about like a cohesive plan, all the specifications that go into it. There's the number of items that individual, and I call them specifications, that they're called, that I have to pick out throughout the process is overwhelming.
I mean, it's pretty incredible.
It's enormous,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I mean, you're down to handles. You're picking out paint colors. You're picking out baseboard that you probably never think about, right? And you've got a gazillion profiles. And then once you start getting inundated with all these different questions, you're like, well, this wasn't even on my mind.
Yeah.
And try to do that as early as possible. You really want to get that, an ideal situation is you want to have all of that dialed in before we ever break ground or start a project. Those things, again, in an ideal situation, this never happens, but are all specified so that everybody's on the same page. We know what we're doing. We know what needs to be purchased. We know where everything needs to be what needs to go. And I think that's one of the things that when you're first jumping into the project that is often they're surprised about. And it seems like, well, it shouldn't be this hard, I think is a thought, right? It's like, well, why do we have to pick out this item? So,
I mean, it's like you want to have that freedom of choice, but it's also inundating at the same time.
It is.
Most people don't think about it.
Right, don't think about it. And ideally, I mean, we need to have that stuff picked out as soon as possible. I mean, I'm dealing with a number of, 5-10 projects at a time, and trying to get these dialed in, things selected. For example, right now we're doing the floor framing on a house. Well, we have not been able to specify the tub for the owner yet. And the tub is critical because it has a tub drain that goes down and that goes to the floor joist. I need to have the floor joist lined in a certain location so that we don't have to cut into the floor joist later, which we really can't. I mean, there's always a way to do things, but it becomes much more expensive. So even down to like the tub needs to be specified before we're even going through the framing process. That's not necessarily going to be put in for another 8 months. But yeah, so I think that's one of the things that when you're jumping into a construction project is thinking about the time that it's going to take, the permitting it's going to take, and I know it's frustrating a lot of times because as owners, you're ready to go at that point. Like you've spent all this time just deciding that it's go time,
right?
And then it's like, actually, I've got to put the brakes on. It's not go time.
Yeah. And both Garrett and I know from personal experience, doing the office and of course doing my own home, and there's a lot that goes into it.
There's a lot that goes into it.
And it brings up my next question about like, what are some of the most common issues that come up as far as in those first stages of the project?
Well, I think from an owner's perspective, it goes back to figuring out what the design is actually going to be, right? We work as a design build firm, and that's what I recommend doing. Going with is more of a design build firm.
Explain that as quickly as you can.
Okay, so a design build firm would be like in-house. You go with a general contractor, so that'd be me, the builder. The builder's the one who's ultimately responsible for the construction of the project, right? They're the ones who are bringing that vision to reality. Then you have the architect, you have some engineers that come in structurally for HVAC and so forth. But when you work in it in the kind of classic fashion of the design bid build format or model, then the builder's not brought until the very end. And a lot of times the design is not actually brought in. An architect will tell us where things go, but they don't tell us what goes there. And so in the old form, it would be typically we wouldn't start talking about what those items were going to be that went in place, like what's the actual design, until the very end. So one of the better things to do, in my opinion, is to kind of start off with a builder in the very beginning. They're the ones who you're going to have to be, that's the partner with you throughout the whole thing, right? And that, you want to firm up that partnership. And also, I think it gives you a good idea of what that general contractor is going to be like if you're working through with the permitting phases, the design phases. They're kind of through the whole process with you. So,
and it seems simpler to go with someone where everything's in-house, correct?
Yes.
It's going to be more streamlined.
It should be more cost-effective as well, right? It definitely should be more cost-effective because you're not paying for overhead in different, disciplines, right? So it's all in-house.
Okay.
And it's crucial too because like what we do for it is you get the design dialed in-house and do like renderings, right? So those renderings, a rendering, what it is it's basically a 3D view, a photorealistic 3D view of what it's going to look like at the end. And if we do that process, once we get everything specified, hang that up on the wall so that everybody knows, hey, this is what it's supposed to look like. This is what we're going for. This is what the owners want. So,
okay.
Yeah.
As far as so you get to this point and you're rearing to go, let's talk about surprises. What do people, other than what we've already talked about, what do people tend to be most often surprised by once they get into things?
Well, it's got to be budget first, right?
Yeah, every time.
Every time, right? Yeah. I mean, costs add up so fast. It's remarkable.
And they change a lot sometimes.
And they can definitely change, yeah. And and that's going back to having them specified, they shouldn't change after that. Once you have something specified, unless like material prices go up, the scope of work is in place. And that scope of work is well defined. But if the scope of work's not well defined and you start getting into the construction project, like, oh, I want to add this, I didn't think about that.
Which happens every time.
It happens pretty much every time.
Right.
Yeah.
And from our experience, it feels like you have to expect the unexpected, right? Because something will come up on every project.
Well, and let's say this because most owners don't know what to expect, right? So expecting the unexpected is just like, you don't really know what's going on.
That's a good way of saying it.
So it's not that you don't like have your expectations in the wrong place, you just don't even know what to expect. I think that's a really challenging aspect of it too, right? Okay. Especially for your first time building something. I mean, if you're a developer and you've gone through it numerous times, you understand kind of where you're coming in. But there's a lot of frustrations that come in with it, and and it's very difficult what's in your mind to kind of get to that end goal. Like, oh, I want it to be like this. Just like everything, I guess, right? Our expectations might be different than what actually ends up in place, right?
And so given what you just said, what should people consider that's not typically on their minds? Like, what sort of advice could you give people that, hasn't already been covered in kind of the unexpected?
When thinking about the budget, I would say you want to start to put yourself in a position to where you know how much you want to spend, how much you can spend, right? And then really do your own work and adding up what that's going to cost, right? So do your own work in putting together an Excel spreadsheet that sums it all up. Because it's easy to get caught on like, well, that's $100, that's $100, that's $500, that's $1,000. And doing the mental math on that, it usually doesn't help you very much, because your mental math, we tend to have a lower value in our head than what that actually sums up to be.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And there's so many moving parts.
You know,
There's so many moving numbers.
I always say construction, we have the most variables to deal with. I mean, we're dealing with weather, we're dealing with material prices, that we're dealing with just getting material, we're dealing with clients, we're dealing with subcontractors. Like it's unbelievable the amount of moving parts, and just the physical world too, right? I mean, just like wood shrinks, right? I mean,
Garrett and I have always said, like, you guys take it from every angle possible, you know, and have to deliver in the end and throughout the process as well. So, any parting thoughts on the kind of the gist of what we've talked about so far?
I'm gonna say one other thing is that there are setting expectations. So going back to expectations, the level of finish of something and what you expect. So just because you're going to say, okay, I want to have drywall there, that level of finish, like the quality in product, varies a ton. And know what you want on the end. If you want a super small wall that you'll never see any reflections on, or shadows on, that like there's no imperfections whatsoever, that's going to cost more. So in your head, make sure that you know what you want, and then talk to your general contractor about that. And you can talk to him about, you know, what level of finish you want in any different location. And the closer you get to perfect, let's say, right, a perfectly smooth wall that is the exact color that you want, that has zero imperfections, the cost to get there is, you know, let's call it 100%. Well, getting to that point, it costs more and more for that each little portion of percentage that you're getting there, right? To get to 85% that level is going to be more cost effective, like as a percentage, until you get to that 100%, because the diminishing returns kind of on it. So getting to perfect costs a lot of money, right? Getting to 90% is going to be more affordable than getting to that 100%. So make sure you know where that expectation is at when you're thinking about it. It's easy to see on a picture in the plans and say, okay, here is the final product, and in your mind for it to kind of be straight lines and perfect, because that's what we see on the plans. But in reality, like we're talking about the variables we're dealing with, it's not going to get there. You can get there, but it's going to have to cost more. So make sure that you and your contractor are setting those expectations of, hey, this is what I expect, and that he is charging you for that amount of money that you expect. Because if they're not charging you for that time, there's going to be frustrations on his side and on your side as far as what that's going to end up being.
Okay. And speaking of expectations, I mean, people often want to interview multiple contractors, rightfully so. Like, what are a couple of like the top questions that you have been asked and you would recommend people ask when they're interviewing a GC?
I think that the first thing I would talk to a GC about is how busy they are. In the GC world, it's difficult to know how much work you actually have at any given time because of things like we talked about with permitting, with the design phase, when the project's actually going to start. So it's very common for general contractors, builders, subcontractors to get overscheduled, overbooked. I mean, it's like, that's the going thing. So most general contractors, I think, have a good heart, builders have a good heart, subcontractors have they want to do a good job, but they're so pressed for time. They're running from one place to the next place, to the next place, to the next place. So the first thing I would talk to them about is, you know, what does their schedule look like? How busy are they? And I think you can get a feel for that too. If somebody doesn't call you back, somebody's not emailing you, it's probably not because they don't want to email you or call you back, it's because they're so busy. And when they're so busy, they're not going to be able to provide enough attention to your project. So I think that's a crucial one.
Anything else?
I find GCs that you kind of want to know where they've come from, I would say. Is it a GC who has come up as a framer, you know, has done construction his whole life, has moved into the GC world? Because a GC essentially is kind of the overall orchestrator of the project. That's the manager of everything. They need to know how everything works and goes together. So when they're looking at like the plans, they need to know how an HVAC system is going to run through a building so that they can account for that later, so that you don't have a 6-foot high ceiling somewhere because the soffit came down to cover up an HVAC system. So I think knowing the background of a general contractor is important. And I often find that the best general contractors are someone who's been working in the field. Maybe they come as a subcontractor, you know, maybe they grew up their whole life and have just moved into that world. But really, those people should be they're not the experts in everything, but they're the experts in the overall design and
the big
build.
picture,
And that's what's important for you. And again, the general contractor, they're working with the sub. So a lot of times, like a subcontractor will come in, they'll have never looked at the plans. They're running from one job site to the next, and you come in and you say, okay, we've got to frame this house up. Well, they don't even know what you have to. The general contractor is directing them on how that house needs to be built, where things need to be at locations and stuff. And so, I think it's critical to find someone who has that experience, and maybe they built it through being a general contractor, or they've been in the field for a long time. So it's a critical aspect. It's not just a businessman. It's not somebody who's just. And I think this is sometimes perceived this way as a general contractor just goes out and gets subcontractors, and they're like the accounting firm that manages the money and then manages the contracts, but it's very far from the truth.
Yeah, and in our experience with you and for me and others, like the relationship that the GC has with the subs and the project as a whole is crucial.
It is crucial.
To a successful outcome.
100% crucial. I mean, I like to, the subcontractors are really part of our team. We have a core group that we work with. There's always new incomings out, some guys going in, but if a general contractor, back when I was growing up in New Mexico, and it was a small town, we had a construction company. We did everything in-house, right? We framed it, we tiled it, we plumbed it, we were electricians and did everything in-house. And so that's that cohesive team that everybody's on the same page. With a general contractor, especially in places like Denver, bringing in those subcontractors, they really are part of the umbrella of that company, right? So if I could afford to have a full-time electrician, I would. But instead, we have subcontractors, but they're really part of the team, And that GC is the one that kind of brings them all together to bring that project to life.
Well, and I mean, there's no better example than what you did for us here at 35th and Mariposa. So thank you. Thank you for being here today and sharing your expertise. Again, it's Luke and James. If you'd like to reach out to James, please feel free to find out us at bringhomedenver.com. We thank you for being here and look forward to seeing you again soon.